many did you get, really, Jerry? They said 34. Did they get all of them? Or did you have private graveyards? I said, Dad, I'm the best. What can I say to somebody like that, right?
This serial killer was described as the most sexually deviant person ever encountered by prosecutors. Picture this: a charming, clean-cut young man in a police uniform, the image of authority and security, patrolling Florida's quiet streets in the early 1970s. But what if this officer wasn't just a protector, but someone whose real motive behind the badge was sinister beyond imagination? This officer was Gerard John Schaefer, a man who turned his uniform into the perfect camouflage for his horrific fantasies. Gerard Schaefer wasn't born a monster, or at least it didn't seem that way. Born on March 25, 1946 in Wisconsin, Schaefer's early life gave little indication of the horrors he'd later commit. His family eventually relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, and then later to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Schaefer's childhood seemed relatively ordinary on the surface, but underneath, it was anything but. His relationship with his father, Gerard Sr., was troubled. His father was reportedly an alcoholic who verbally abused Schaefer, causing feelings of inadequacy and humiliation that would haunt him. Schaefer's mother was religious, and Gerard would later use this connection to mask his true nature, often quoting Bible verses and appearing devout. Despite his mother's religious obsession, he was close to her. She was protective of him when it came to Gerard Sr.'s abusive tirades against her children, and she would do her best to defend them. His parents' relationship clearly bothered him, with their constant arguments and tendency to belittle each other. It wasn't an environment that Gerard flourished in, but as twisted and toxic as this household dynamic was, Schaefer kept up appearances. Something that added to the twisted relationships between family members was Schaefer's father favored his daughter over his son. This was made painfully obvious to young Gerard, and it was something before the age of 12 that he began to wish he had been born a girl. He started wearing women's underwear in private, and he would masturbate while he wore them. He displayed a complex relationship with how he thought of women, and while at first Gerard wanted to emulate them, that would eventually change. As a teenager, Schaefer did display early warning signs of something much darker brewing beneath the surface. But at first, they were relatively tame in comparison to what he would eventually become. He continued to wear women's underwear as he entered his teenage years, but in addition to this, he discovered autoerotic asphyxiation. He would tie himself to trees and hang from the neck while bringing himself to climax. At this time, he was also reportedly developing disturbing fantasies of bondage, power, and dominance over women. While from a young age, Gerard had felt some kind of inclination to exert power over the opposite sex, it hadn't manifested in a violent way towards other people yet. As Gerard began interacting with girls his own age and getting into relationships, the violence would slowly emerge. Gerard would claim that his first girlfriend, whom he met and dated around the age of 14, wanted him to pretend to rape her. Gerard claimed he was repulsed by the idea, and that when he refused, she broke up with him. Was this rejection what ultimately made Gerard snap into the predator that he truly was? Because after this, his desires became much more malevolent, and he began sneaking around the neighborhood, watching his female neighbors get undressed. There was one fixation that almost got him caught, though. He had taken to spying on his teenage neighbor, Lee Hainline Bonadies, while she got undressed in the evening. And although after high school their paths would diverge, they would eventually come together in the most tragic way years later. But before that would take place, Schaefer had some time to kill. Schaefer was clever. He kept up a respectable facade, excelling in school and remaining well-liked by his peers. His early relationships provided some disturbing insights into his character and hinted at the motivations behind his later crimes. Schaefer had other failed relationships in his youth, marked by feelings of inadequacy and rejection. His first marriage to Martha Fogg in 1968 lasted less than a year and ended due to Schaefer's controlling behavior and emotional instability. In the divorce proceedings, she cited his extreme cruelty as the main reason for the separation. The breakdown of this marriage seemed to exacerbate his deep-seated anger towards women, reinforcing his need to dominate and punish them. Schaefer later married Teresa Dean in 1971. But this relationship followed a similar pattern of manipulation and control. However, it was slightly more suited to him, as Teresa would give in to his incessant demands for sex and also shared a love of his hobby for fishing, so it seemed like they made perhaps a decent match. But Schaefer's inability to maintain healthy romantic connections mirrored his inner turmoil. His repeated failures in relationships not only contributed to his insecurities, but also fueled his misogynistic fantasies. Schaefer craved total power and control, which most women wouldn't freely give him. So he chose a career path that would allow him to exercise both: law enforcement. In 1971, he joined the Wilton Manors Police Department, a small town police force in Florida. This choice seemed fitting for a man who had longed for authority and had an obsession with controlling others. But as Schaefer's crimes would later reveal, becoming a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about becoming the law, a disguise for his predatory desires. The true nature of Gerard Schaefer: a double life. To the public, Schaefer seemed like a dedicated officer, but in reality, he was using his position to scout and target vulnerable young women. The other officers just thought he was badge happy, as he had a penchant for stopping young women over minor traffic offenses and asking inappropriate questions. He wasn't known as a particularly good cop, and on several occasions, he was almost fired for making stupid mistakes. But what kept him on the force and saved his job was a commendation from a drug bust he'd made, so his incompetence was overlooked. But not for long. He lasted 6 months with Wilton Manors before being fired for finding out personal details of the female motorists that he stopped and calling them and asking them out for dates. I mean, how creepy would that be? And then, after handing in a forged letter of recommendation, he was accepted into the Martin County Sheriff's Department. Schaefer's abuse of power came to a horrifying climax in 1972. It was on July 21st that Paula Sue Wells and Nancy Trotter, both in their teens, were hitchhiking when they were picked up by none other than Gerard Schaefer, who was on duty at the time. Initially, the ride went according to plan, and Gerard dropped them off at Stewart. However, the girls had told him that the next day they wanted to go to Jensen Beach, and Schaefer agreed to take them, this time wearing plain clothes and driving his own car. But what should have been a safe drive quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Schaefer told the girls hitchhiking was too dangerous and that they could have been sold into, quote, white slavery, unquote. Then he deviated from the route and drove them into a remote wooded area near Hutchinson Island. Once there, Schaefer revealed his true intentions, threatening the two girls at gunpoint. He forced them to step out of the car and tied them up, binding them to a tree with ropes around their wrists and ankles, nooses around their necks, and he threatened to kill them if they screamed. He told them that they would be raped and murdered. But before he could enact his plan, he received a police dispatch on the radio. Schaefer's plan was to come back later and finish the job, but he underestimated the two young girls. Paula and Nancy managed to wiggle free of their bindings while he was away and ran through the woods until they found help. 2 hours later, Schaefer's own arrogance got the best of him. He returned to the site only to find his captives missing, and he didn't even try to cover his tracks. Schaefer's plan was foiled. Realizing that the teenagers would alert the authorities, Schaefer decided to concoct a story that he had merely tried to, quote, scare them straight, unquote, about the dangers of hitchhiking. He was really just a moral, upstanding citizen after all. Shockingly, he was believed, and the charges were initially minor. He was merely suspended from duty. But this incident wasn't a one-time scare tactic. It was a glimpse into the mind of a sadistic man who had much darker plans. After being suspended, Schaefer faced scrutiny and was eventually fired from the police force. But what came next was even more chilling. Following Schaefer's suspension, bodies began to surface. In April of 1973, a shocking discovery was made in Martin County. On April 1st, a father and son searching for aluminum cans made a gruesome discovery in Oak Hammock Park, Florida. They came across 2 decomposed bodies, partially buried in a shallow grave just over 2 feet deep. The bodies were scattered around the area, with parts dismembered and disturbed by wildlife. One of the victims was still wearing remnants of blue jeans with a distinctive Roadrunner emblem, while the other was found completely nude. Near the grave, a tree showed deep scratch marks, and there were remnants of one victim's torso tied to the trunk, suggesting a brutal struggle. Other evidence showed that both victims had suffered severe spinal injuries, with their bones severed using a knife or a machete. There were also multiple fractures to the victim's jawbones, and one victim had a gunshot wound in the lower jaw, likely inflicted with a .22 caliber pistol. The disturbing scene hinted at the victims being hung or bound to a tree prior to their deaths, as impressions of the bark indicated that they had been suspended long enough to leave marks. Additionally, a nearby banyan tree bore the initials GJ carved into its trunk, with a knife or an axe marks around its roots that contained shredded fibers from the victim's clothing. The remains were identified as Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. With Schaefer in custody and his modus operandi with female hitchhikers being investigated, it was only natural that he would be considered a suspect for that crime. But this was not all. The parents of one victim gave a description of a man they'd seen accompanying the girls on the day of their disappearance, and you guessed it, it matched Gerard Schaefer's appearance. Now that Schaefer was a potential suspect, he had to be linked to the crime. And this is when one of the most important parts of the case takes place: the search of the properties. In 1973, while Schaefer was out on bail awaiting trial for the kidnapping of the 2 teen girls, Paula and Nancy, police made a gruesome discovery at his mother's house. Investigators found a stash of personal belongings belonging to the missing women. Items such as jewelry, diaries, and photographs were recovered, linking him to the disappearances of several women. Police also discovered writings, sketches, and morbid stories in Schaefer's home that seemed to reflect his sadistic fantasies and intentions. As the investigation continued, what emerged was a portrait of a highly intelligent but deeply disturbed individual. Schaefer was a man who delighted in inflicting pain and fear on his victims. He would often kidnap, torture, and kill young women in remote areas, sometimes binding them to trees or even hanging them. Schaefer took advantage of his police training to avoid detection, meticulously covering his tracks. It seemed that his favorite part of the whole ordeal was subjecting these women to degradation. He would purposefully kidnap 2 at one time so that he could pit them against each other before killing them. He'd make the girls beg, each girl turning against their friend and explaining why Gerard should kill that girl first rather than them and just spare them. It was obvious that Gerard had many victims. But the hardest thing investigators would have to figure out was what the total kill list was. So let's break down some of the possible victims linked to Gerard Schaefer. There's no definitive answer on when or where he actually began killing, or even how many people he may have murdered. Sometimes he hinted at the number of victims he killed, while also denying any murders. At one point, he claimed he had victims over 3 continents when he traveled to North Africa and Europe before taking up his position as a police officer in Florida. Most experts think he started around 1969, with some estimating that he may have had up to 28 victims. Although some people, like author Patrick Kendrick, suggest a closer count of 11. Schaefer's known victims list is a disturbing look into his actions and patterns, though, and they're connected by horrifying similarities. So let's start with 1966, Nancy Elaine Leichner and Pamela Ann Nader, who disappeared while hiking. Although authorities initially believed that they had drowned, Schaefer later confessed to their murders. From there, in September 1969, there's Lee Bonadies, remember his neighbor that he used to spy on as a kid? Well, her remains were found in 1978 with 3 gunshot wounds to her body. This strange connection to Lee doesn't end there, though. Lee went missing roughly around the time that Schaefer's parents got divorced in 1969. At the time, Lee had told her husband that she had been contacted by a friend who worked for the CIA and he wanted to offer her a job. Then she got in her car and was never seen alive again. Now, this is a strange coincidence because at the time when Schaefer was confronting the emotional turmoil of childhood and the separation of his parents, he returned to a figure of his past when he was merely a teen, and that woman was Lee Bonadies. Another probable victim, Carmen Marie Halleck, went missing in December of 1969, and items belonging to her were later found at Schaefer's home. And then there are 2 young girls, both below the age of 10, Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson, who disappeared from Pompano Beach just after Christmas in 1969, and Schaefer would later claim responsibility, though some investigators would end up questioning his story. And here's where things get particularly disturbing. Schaefer later stated that he only targeted the 2 little girls because he was inspired by Albert Fish and what Fish had said about eating the flesh of young children. There's also evidence that he may have continued killing through the early 1970s. Victims included teenagers Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Farmer, whose decapitated bodies were discovered in 1973, as well as Suzanne Gale Poole, whose remains were found bound in a mangrove tree in 1974. Though her identity was only confirmed recently, it fits Schaefer's brutal style of murder. And finally, we have the haunting case of Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox, 2 young women hitchhiking in 1973, who vanished days before Schaefer went to jail for other crimes. Their remains were found 4 years later, and personal items linked them back to him during search of his property. It was clear from their remains that they had been bound with balling wire, and suspension marks were visible, indicating that either one or both had been hung from a tree before being killed. So let's get into the search. Inside the locked bedroom of Gerard Schaefer's mother's house, police found shocking evidence that revealed his dark and disturbing fantasies. They uncovered over 300 pages of stories that Schaefer had written over several years. The narratives vividly described the kidnapping, torture, and execution of teenage girls and young women. Schaefer's writings depicted these women as and in some stories, he referred to victims by name like Belinda and Carmen. One particularly graphic account involved a victim being hanged near Powerline Road. Schaefer's stories showed a clear obsession with methods of hanging and the degradation of his victims. Many of these writings described how he forced his victims to consume beer or wine while standing on makeshift platforms with nooses around their necks, allowing him to observe their distress. He reportedly visited the scenes of his crimes weeks or even months later and would then this is really disturbing, but he would commit acts of necrophilia with the dismembered bodies, or he would even remove the teeth from the skulls to keep as trophies. His fascination extended to historical methods of execution, and he detailed the pleasure he felt while he would watch women urinate or defecate in terror right before their deaths. And the search didn't stop with finding these disturbing writings. The police also found 11 guns, multiple hunting knives, and sections of rope at his residence. They discovered dozens of softcore pornographic magazines that Schaefer had altered to include images of nude, bound women hanging from trees or even depicted with bullet wounds. In addition to these altered magazines, 37 Polaroid photographs were discovered. These images showed women being hanged or mutilated, and authorities believed that the scenes were taken in dense underground areas. Now, although these photographs were a little too blurry to actually identify the victims, the images of the brutality were unmistakable. One particularly haunting detail involved several photographs of Schaefer himself wearing women's clothing and posing as if he were being hanged. In these pictures, feces was smeared on his body, suggesting that his fantasies often involved reversing roles with his victims and exploring these perversions. The investigation also led to a troubling connection with an individual Schaefer had met in Morocco in 1970. A letter was found from his acquaintance in Australia, and it contained Polaroids of women from a small village who had all been brutally disemboweled and mutilated during a massacre. This connection suggested that Schaefer's interests and behaviors were not just limited to isolated crimes in the United States, but were part of a broader pattern of fascination with violence and brutality. It's possible that his claims of having victims over 3 continents were actually true. In addition to these disturbing images, Schaefer's collection of items potentially used for murders further incriminated him. Investigators found jewelry and items like passports and clothing that belonged to several missing women. Notable discoveries included a heart-shaped charm with the initials MTN, and even a gold locket inscribed with Lee, which belonged to Lee Bonadies. They also found the driver's license of Barbara Ann Wilcox and the passport of Colette Marie Goodenough, both who had been missing since January 1973. They also found human remains on his property. Teeth and bones from at least 8 different victims were recovered, solidifying Schaefer's connection to numerous unsolved cases. At Schaefer's residence in Martin County, police found fewer items but still significant evidence, including 2 human teeth, knives, forearms, and a blood-stained pillowcase. Schaefer's wife was also found to be in possession of Jessup's purse, a gift from her husband, which he had tried to dispose of after the discovery of the bodies in Oak Hammock Park. I mean, can you imagine your partner or your husband giving you a purse as a gift only to find out it used to belong to a woman that he had murdered and dismembered? It would be so disturbing. And Schaefer had glib explanations for each of the items found on his properties. He said the notes and stories were an experiment he was tasked with by a psychologist. Allegedly, the psychologist told Schaefer to write down all of the terrible things in his head. And as for the bone fragments and teeth, Schaefer blamed it on an ex-roommate, claiming that he had planted it in the home. As for the purse, he said he'd just purchased it in Morocco and that he'd simply come across Wilcox's driver's license by chance. Yeah, I'm sure. But his explanations just didn't line up, and investigators knew that they had caught a potential serial killer. After his arrest in 1973, Gerard Schaefer was charged with the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The prosecution used the evidence found in Schaefer's home, including the victim's belongings and Schaefer's own writings, to build a strong case against him. During the pretrial, Schaefer denied any culpability in the murders, but failed to account for his whereabouts on the dates that they took place. When the trial started on September 19th, he ultimately chose not to testify at all. Place's parents took the stand and gave a devastating testimony. They pointed to Schaefer as the man who had been with their daughter before she went missing. They recognized him as the man they'd seen Place and her friend Jessup with before that fateful day. On September 27, 1972, Susan Place and her friend Georgia Jessup left Susan's house in Fort Lauderdale, saying that they were going to a local park with a man named Jerry Shepard. That man was actually Gerard Schaefer, whom Susan's mother, Lucille, had seen. On the day they left, Lucille Place had a strange feeling about this Jerry character. She took a good look at him, noting details about his face and his car, observations that would later prove crucial, because for a while, that case had gone completely cold, and it seemed like no suspects were in sight. But soon, that would all change. Lucille had also found a letter in her daughter's bedroom penned by Jerry Shepard. The address that the letter was sent from was 333 Martin Ave in Stewart. Lucille went to the address and she looked for Jerry, only to discover after speaking with the building manager that the apartment was actually registered to Gerard Schaefer and that he had recently been arrested for kidnapping. Months passed with no word from Susan or Georgia. Lucille, haunted by her last memory of Jerry, went to the authorities with her suspicions. Armed with that description she had committed to her memory and all of the information from the letter she had found, she was eventually able to identify him in a lineup, which sealed Schaefer's fate. Lucille and her husband, Ira, discussed all of this in court as the jury listened in attentively. Their testimony was airtight. But Schaefer's defense tried to dismantle it by challenging their identification, aiming to shake the jury's confidence in the parents' account of what happened. In a twist that seemed straight out of a detective novel, a court clerk also testified. They'd discovered that Schaefer's vehicle was registered to the exact address Place's mother had noted on the night of her disappearance. If you're following the clues, this was an intense moment. It meant that every lead was drawing a clearer and more horrifying line right back to Schaefer. Forensic experts also took the stand to reveal even more. The medical examiner, Dr. Richard Sauveron, presented evidence from the autopsies identifying the girls' bodies by dental records and by unique healed bone fractures. What Sauveron testified to was nothing short of grim. Place had suffered a gunshot wound from a .20 caliber bullet to her lower jaw. Then another medical examiner took over and detailed how the girls had been restrained and tortured in their final moments. Schaefer had left knife marks on the bones, and fibers from clothing were found on the tree roots where they had been held. This was confirmed by a microanalyst who analyzed fibers from ropes and clothing discovered at the crime scene. Altogether, the forensic evidence was damning. Now, this next part of the case just blows your mind. The two other women who escaped, Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells, testified that Schaefer had been the one who had kidnapped and terrorized them. They painted a terrifying picture of how Schaefer had abducted them, tied them to a tree, and threatened to bury them alive where no one would ever find them. There was even footage of Trotter and Wells bound in the same way as Place and Jessup shown in court as evidence of Schaefer's modus operandi. Schaefer's lawyer tried to argue that because these girls escaped, no real harm was done. Really? Just let that sink in for a minute. He tried to minimize an attempted murder, but saying, no harm was done, they escaped, no big deal. Absolutely unreal. And as if things couldn't get darker, the prosecution presented a manuscript written by Schaefer titled, How to Properly Execute Women. Yeah, you heard that right. Schaefer had essentially written a twisted instruction manual on how to murder women. The state argued that Schaefer's writings were practically a blueprint for what he had done multiple times to multiple young girls and women. The defense immediately moved for acquittal, claiming all the evidence was circumstantial, but luckily this motion was quickly denied. Schaefer's defense then went on the offensive, trying to discredit the identification of Schaefer by the victim's parents and others who had seen him with Place and Jessup, but luckily the jury wasn't swayed. There was just too much evidence tying Schaefer to these crimes: eyewitnesses, fiber analysis, medical evidence, even his own writings. They tried another tactic though, suggesting that Place and Jessup had been alive after Schaefer was arrested, but witnesses, crime scene evidence, and expert testimonies were able to refute this claim as well. Prosecutor Philip Shaler took the jury through the entire horrific chain of evidence, and he left no stone unturned. He reminded everyone of the matching identification by Place's mother, the traces of forensic evidence, and the horrific fact that Schaefer had left those girls to suffer a terrifying death. Schaefer reminded the jury that Schaefer was not only the girl's killer, but had also taken on the roles of prosecutor, judge, and executioner. The only difference between Trotter and Wells and the victims in this case, he said, was pure luck. The defense doubled down on the idea that the prosecution hadn't proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But the problem for Schaefer was that with this much evidence, reasonable doubt was a hard sell. He had been too reckless and he left too much evidence behind. And for an actual police officer who in theory should know what kind of evidence that you shouldn't leave behind, goes to show that maybe Schaefer wasn't as smart as he thought he was. The jury only took 5 hours to deliberate, and at around 11 p.m. that same day, they had reached their verdict. Schaefer was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the judge read the sentence aloud, Schaefer, ever the narcissist, proclaimed his innocence to the press, calling it, quote, the roll of the dice, unquote. The roll of the dice? Okay, buddy. When it came time to discuss sentencing, Schaefer asked to be sent to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison, claiming he was mentally ill. How convenient. Now, all of a sudden, you try to claim you're mentally ill, and that is why you made these meticulous decisions to commit this crime? It's absolutely ridiculous. And just because someone is mentally ill or suffering from some kind of mental health challenge doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go and write a playbook on how to murder women. And luckily, this court was not buying it. On October 4th, 1973, he was sentenced to 2 life sentences to be served in Florida State Prison. Years later, Schaefer's parole was postponed all the way to 2016, effectively ensuring that he would remain behind bars. He appealed his conviction, but luckily it was denied. But the story doesn't end there. Most people in jail are focused on counting down their days, but Schaefer took things to a whole other level. He basically turned his prison cell into a twisted headquarters for running scams and filing endless lawsuits against, well, basically anyone who he felt had wronged him. And if you think prison stopped him from terrorizing people, you are in for a big surprise. One of the first things Schaefer did was start a pretty disturbing mail campaign. Now, by mail campaign, he wasn't writing polite little letters. He was sending out letters that were honestly beyond disturbing. He'd include gruesome, violent details and even wrote stories with himself as the central character, always in some twisted or sadistic role. So imagine receiving that in your mailbox. It was like he wanted to keep a sense of control, to keep terrorizing people from the inside. He would pose as women, get people to pay for soiled underwear. Those who paid, he referred to as his, quote, slaves. Now, if that wasn't enough, Schaefer basically became a, quote, jailhouse lawyer, unquote. In the prison world, a jailhouse lawyer is an inmate who uses their knowledge of the legal system to help other prisoners with their cases, usually in exchange for money, cigarettes, or other favors. And Schaefer was good at it. He knew the law well enough to give advice, file appeals, and draft documents. He became this self-styled legal expert who'd help other inmates with their cases, giving him a certain amount of influence and respect among his peers within the prison. And obviously these weren't serious lawsuits. They were intended to mess with people's lives, keep their attention on him, and honestly just be a nuisance. This was Schaefer's way of staying relevant, of making sure that people outside the prison walls still had to think about him and suffer even more for crossing paths with him. So Schaefer didn't just sit around waiting for his sentence to end. Instead, he used his time to extend his influence, keeping himself in the spotlight, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. It was like his way of saying, you may have locked me up, but I'm not done with you yet. And honestly, that's probably the creepiest part about this story. He found ways to keep hurting people, even from a prison cell, showing just how deep his desire to manipulate ran. And it's shocking that the prison even sent out this mail, because don't they read all ingoing and outgoing mail? Like, You'd think that they would say, this is disgusting, we're not actually mailing this out to somebody, but I guess not. And guess what? That's not all he did in prison. He actually also kept himself busy by filing lawsuits against true crime authors and journalists who wrote about him. He claimed they were spreading lies and defaming him, even though he was already convicted of the crimes. These lawsuits were often just bizarre and included demands for millions of dollars in damages. Schaefer's legal battles ended up turning into a bit of a hobby, as he tried to control the narrative from behind bars. None of the lawsuits were successful, but they certainly added to his infamous legacy. But as most criminals with a horrifying legacy do, Schaefer also had a dramatic end. On December 3rd, 1995, Schaefer was found dead in his cell after being stabbed over 40 times. His face, head, neck, and body were covered in stab wounds. His throat was slashed, and he had several fractured ribs. His right eye was also dislodged, which paints a picture of just how violent the attack was. It was a slaughter. The only clue left behind was a bloody handprint on the cell wall. The guy responsible? Fellow inmate Vincent Rivera. Rivera had a grudge over a petty argument with Schaefer about who got the last bit of hot water, but the motive might not have been that simple. Schaefer was believed to be an informant, leaking information on other inmates. The year before his death, other prisoners had begun targeting him. They'd thrown waste at him and even set his cell on fire a couple of times. So now fast forward to 1999, and Rivera is convicted for Schaefer's murder, which earned him an extra 53 years on top of his existing life sentence for a Tampa double homicide. And despite the evidence, Rivera kept quiet, never admitting to the crime or giving any official reason for it. And so, Gerard Schaefer's secrets died with him, as well as any possible explanation as to why he did what he did. But there are theories. His failed romantic life was closely intertwined with his sadistic tendencies, showcasing how his experiences with women may have influenced his desire for dominance. This, combined with his lifelong fantasies of violence, likely contributed to his escalating acts of brutality. But what is the psychological science behind what drove Schaefer to such cruelty? Psychologists later theorized that he suffered from a combination of sadistic tendencies and deep-seated anger towards women. He was a sadist through and through. But Schaefer wasn't just interested in acting out his fantasies, he wanted to be acknowledged for them. He often boasted in letters and conversations about his crimes, referring to himself as a master criminal. This desire for recognition and validation was a hallmark of his twisted personality. Gerard Schaefer's crimes shocked the nation. But they also left a lingering question. How many other predators are hiding behind respectable facades? Schaefer's life and crimes force us to confront a frightening reality, that the people we trust the most might need to be the ones we should fear the most. He didn't just kill his victims. He shattered the illusion of safety and trust that comes with certain roles in society. So the next time you see a police officer or someone in a position of power, you might find yourself wondering, how well do we really know the people we trust to protect us? Gerard Schaefer wasn't just a murderer. He was a master manipulator who hid his darkest intentions in plain sight. And the haunting question remains, was his craving for violence a singular anomaly? Or is there something more universal in the facade he maintained? It's clear that evil can blend into everyday life, hidden behind smiles, uniforms, and titles we trust. It's a reminder to stay wary, because sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under our beds, but in plain sight, wearing badges.